What's the meaning of life? What's the right way to behave? Have you ever thought about those questions? In earlier socials discussions, we have taken a look at people of the Middle Ages and how they looked to religious beliefs, especially those about the afterlife, to try and answer questions like that. Renaissance thinkers, or people that we refer to as humanists today, reintroduced ideas from pre-Christian times to this religious foundation. They encouraged people to develop their minds and their talents and to use them for the good of society as well as the glory of God. How did these humanists express their ideas and how did these ideas spread? What was the impact of humanist thinking on European society? Well, that's what we're going to start taking a look at today. Think of a time when you changed your mind about something. What caused your new way of thinking to come about? Were you influenced by other people or by things that you saw or read, or maybe some other type of factor? Now, I want you to imagine a new way of thinking taking place across a whole continent. That's what happened during the Renaissance. This new way of thinking appears to have started in the northern Italian city-states, where scholars that we now call humanists looked back to the ancient classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. Now, these scholars, they studied Greek and Roman writings and art and applied classical ideas into their own lives and to their own work. The Greek and Roman civilizations had not been forgotten during the Middle Ages. Latin, the language of the Romans, remained the language of scholars in the church. Ancient writers like Aristotle and Plato were studied from the Christian perspective. However, during the Renaissance, educated people began to look at ancient works in a different way. They admired the eloquent writing styles of ancient writers and became interested in their ideas about society, politics, history, and even the arts. You might say that the Renaissance worldview was a result of intercultural contact with earlier civilizations. The Greek and Roman civilizations that form what we call classical civilizations. The Islamic civilization that preserved the knowledge of classical civilization and further developed it, especially in the sciences, math, and medicine of the great civilizations in India and the Far East. Humanist ideas spread mainly among the wealthy people in society. Reading and discussing ancient writers became kind of a fad among the new merchant and business class that you've heard about in previous discussions. The classical concept that was most important to Renaissance thinkers and artists was the belief in the dignity and potential of the individual. They believed that people could shape their lives through their own efforts and their own talents. Now, these new ideas were easily integrated into the Christian worldview. To develop one's talents was to serve God because God had provided you with those talents. The humanists believe that human beings can use the power of reason or thinking to find truth for themselves. It's important for a person to have an open, curious, and questioning mind. People can achieve great things through learning. Individuals should be skilled in many different areas. They should develop not just their minds, but also their bodies and spirits. Francesco Petrarch, a humanist thinker of the early Renaissance, saw the classical past as a very glorious time. He believed it was far superior to both the medieval world, which he called a dark age, and the time in which he lived. He wrote, "Among the many subjects that interested me, I dwelt especially upon antiquity, for our own age has always repelled me. In order to forget my own time, I have constantly striven to place myself in spirit in other ages, and consequently I delighted in history." Later, humanists began to see theirs as a glorious time, a renaissance, when the ideas and values of the ancient times were reborn. Greek and Roman manuscripts had been preserved in libraries in the Muslim world and in monastery and cathedral libraries throughout Europe. Petrarch and other humanists collected these manuscripts and made copies and translations of them. In 1 year alone, humanist Giovanni Aruspa brought 240 Greek manuscripts to Europe. Humanists wanted to make the ideas of these ancient works available to the widest possible readership. They thought that in order to be truly cultured, a person should read good books and look at great works of art. Think of some people who you think affect the different thinking in our society today. Consider people like politicians, activists, writers, artists, and even filmmakers. What are the ways that they use to get their message across? Renaissance humanists were often the intellectual leaders of their communities. They were humanist scholars, philosophers, teachers, public officials, writers, scientists, architects, artists, and even musicians. Some of them had important positions in government and church and at royal courts. As a result of this, they were able to affect many aspects of Renaissance society. Renaissance humanists were interested in what classical authors had written about good government. Cicero's idea that public service was the duty of everyone in society was very influential. Civic humanists believed that being a responsible citizen meant educating yourself about history and political issues and working to improve society. Do you think that's similar today? Think about that. Why is being an informed citizen valued, not only back then, but today? Think about some of the subjects that you study in school. Why do you think educators decided that students should study these particular subjects? What other things do you think would be interesting or useful to study? One of the most important ways that the humanists influenced Renaissance society was in the emphasis that they put on education. The humanist Leonardo Bruni wrote admiringly about a wealthy merchant who never wasted time by loitering, but returning home after business and spent his time in studying Greek and Latin. Many humanists were dedicated teachers who ran their own schools. They believed that it was important to train young people's characters and bodies as well as their minds. This approach to education is sometimes called educating the whole child. They also encouraged a curious, questioning attitude in their students. Many rulers and wealthy people hired humanists as tutors for their children. Humanist teachers added to the traditional subjects studied throughout the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, often you would see grammar, public speaking, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, theology, scripture, and medicine being taught. During the Renaissance time, many of the studies that were added were Greek and Roman writings, physical training, ethics and morality, so what is the right behavior, aesthetics, or the philosophy of beauty. Manners and behavior were taught, as well as history and persuasiveness. The classical texts that were admired and studied by Renaissance scholars were written before the beginning of Christianity. Renaissance thinkers emphasized ideas and values such as individual achievement and the importance of history in the arts. Religion continued to play an important part in their lives, just as it had during the Middle Ages. Petrarch, for example, was a devout Christian. Desiderius Erasmus, born in 1466 in the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, was the outstanding humanist scholar of his time. He said famously, "When I get a little money, I buy books, and if any is left, I buy food and clothes." He is one who edited a new Greek version of the New Testament. Did you get the joke in this digital image? It was created for an environmental cleanup campaign. The artist was asked to replace the main figure in a famous painting with a frog. He used the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci because he thought it was the most famous painting in the Western world. The Mona Lisa is an example of new style of art that developed during the Renaissance. Artists became interested in portraying the beauty of the human body in the natural world. Patrons, or people who paid artists to produce works, played an important role in promoting the arts during the Renaissance. They included members of the new wealthy merchant class as well as the government and the church. Artists made works to decorate private homes or to display in public places. Like Michelangelo, many artists found inspiration in the art of the ancient Greeks and Romans. In the Middle Ages, most art had religious themes, and this continued through the Renaissance. But influenced by humanist ideas, Renaissance artists began to interpret these subjects in new ways. The Renaissance also saw a growing interest in portraits and landscapes. Many contemporary artists also draw inspiration from the past. Ojibwe artist Norval Morrisseau uses images created by First Nations peoples long ago. Petroglyphs, which are carved into rock with sharp implements, and pictographs, which are drawn into rock surfaces in the drawings on the birchbark scrolls of the Ojibwe Midewiwin societies. Some First Nations people criticize Morrisseau for breaking traditional restrictions by showing sacred beliefs in his paintings. But he defends his work by saying that he wants to restore cultural pride in his people. This description of an architect comes from the writings of Roman engineer and architect Marcus Vitruvius Pollio. His book, De Architectura, was rediscovered during the Renaissance. It influenced Renaissance architectures to include features of classical buildings in their work. Like painters and sculptors, Renaissance architects raised the status of their profession from skilled laborer to artist. Sculptors in the Middle Ages were seen as craftspeople rather than artists. They were part of the construction team for cathedrals, carving figures and other decorations that told biblical stories. They generally did not even sign their work. The role of the artist changed dramatically during the Renaissance. Just as wealth raised the social status of merchants and business people, their artistic genius raised the status of artists. Sculptors like Michelangelo became celebrities with international reputations. In the early Renaissance, writers focused on translating the works of Roman and Greek writers and copying their styles. At the same time, books or texts written in the vernacular, or that is the language that the people spoke, like Italian, French, and English, became more accessible. Humanism influenced writers to focus on expressing their thoughts and emotions. Petrarch was the leading Italian poet of his time. He's most famous for the hundreds of love poems that he wrote to a woman called Laura. Christine de Pizan was a humanist writer, some of whose ideas may seem very modern to you. One of a very few women to receive a humanist education, Pizan was educated at the court of King Charles V of France. When she was left a widow at the age of 25, she had 3 very small children to support, and so she decided to make her living by writing. Pizan was Europe's first professional woman writer. Pizan's many works included poetry, history, essays, and biographies. In her writings, she protested the way that women were portrayed in medieval literature. In The City of Women, she argued that men and women should be judged not on the basis of their gender, but on their abilities and their virtues.